Napoleon had entered the world in 1769 on the rugged island of Corsica, a land that had only recently fallen under French control. His family belonged to the minor nobility, but their title carried little wealth or influence. The air of the island was harsh and untamed, filled with the scent of salt from the sea and the echoes of mountain winds. He grew up surrounded by craggy peaks, stone villages, and the fierce pride of a people who had long resisted foreign rule. From his earliest years, he sensed that he was part of something apart, neither fully Corsican nor yet accepted as French. This feeling of displacement shaped his view of the world, giving him a relentless need to prove himself. His childhood was marked by solitude and austerity. He spent hours wandering alone through the hills, tracing the paths of streams and studying the shapes of the land, as if they were puzzles meant to be solved. He preferred the company of books to that of other children, burying himself in stories of heroes, conquerors, and philosophers. He consumed histories of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, memorizing their campaigns and tactics, imagining himself one day standing in their place. The island's isolation sharpened his mind and hardened his spirit. He learned early that respect was not given freely, it had to be seized and defended. When his father arranged for him to study in mainland France, Napoleon was still just a boy. The journey across the sea marked a turning point in his life. He entered a world vastly different from the one he had known, a world of sprawling cities, refined manners, and rigid social hierarchies. The other boys at the military school saw him as an outsider. They mocked his Corsican accent, his awkward manners, and his unfashionable clothes. He endured their scorn and silence, storing every insult like a stone in the foundation of his resolve. In those lonely years, he forged the armor of discipline and pride that would protect him for the rest of his life. His days were consumed by study. He showed a particular gift for mathematics and strategy, subjects that allowed him to see order where others saw only chaos. He excelled at the art of fortifications, the movements of troops, the logic of war. While other boys idled or sought amusements, he remained bent over his books late into the night, the flicker of candlelight casting sharp shadows over his thin, determined face. He believed that only knowledge and relentless effort could lift him above his lowly standing. Every achievement, no matter how small, became proof that he was destined for more than obscurity. Yet beneath his discipline burned a fierce, restless energy. He dreamed of returning to Corsica not as a mocked student, but as a leader, a figure strong enough to command respect. The pride of his homeland and the humiliation he endured in France fused into a single driving force, an unshakable will to rise. He began to see the world as a battlefield where only the bold could survive, and where hesitation was a kind of death. The quiet boy from the mountains carried within him the seed of ambition that would one day shake continents. By the time he completed his schooling, he had transformed himself. He no longer appeared as the awkward Corsican exile, but as a young officer whose gaze was sharp and calculating. The years of isolation had made him self-reliant, the years of scorn had made him defiant, and the years of study had made him brilliant. Though few recognized it then, the path of his life had already set its course. He had become a creature of will and intellect, prepared to climb through the ranks of a world that had once rejected him. The boy born on a distant island had begun his march toward destiny, and nothing in him would ever allow retreat. Napoleon entered the tumult of the French Revolution as if stepping onto a stage built for his ambitions. France was unraveling, the old monarchy crumbling while new powers struggled to rise from its ruins. Armies were disorganized, generals fell as quickly as they rose, and political factions devoured one another. In this chaos, where many saw only danger, he saw opportunity. He understood instinctively that revolutions were not sustained by ideals alone, but by decisive action and the force of arms. He placed himself where the noise was loudest, where the risks were greatest, certain that glory could only be claimed on the edge of disaster. He first drew notice during the Siege of Toulon in 1793, when Royalists, aided by the British Navy, had fortified the city. The French forces were faltering, leaders hesitant, morale fractured. Napoleon, then a young artillery officer, studied the terrain obsessively, tracing lines on maps, pacing the rocky hillsides, and calculating every angle of cannon fire. He proposed a daring plan to seize key heights that would cut off the enemy's harbor defenses. While others hesitated, he acted with precision and speed, dragging heavy artillery across mud and stone, positioning them under cover of darkness. His relentless energy ignited those around him. When the cannons roared and the enemy lines broke, Toulon fell. The victory shocked those who had dismissed him as an obscure Corsican outsider. At 24, he was made a brigadier general, and whispers of his name began to circulate in Paris. The revolution was devouring its own children, yet Napoleon seemed immune to its instability. He maneuvered through shifting political tides with cold pragmatism, offering loyalty not to any faction, but to France's survival and to his own ascent. He possessed an uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, to anticipate not only movements on a battlefield, but the tremors of public sentiment and political ambition. His campaigns in Italy revealed this talent even more starkly. The French armies were poorly supplied and demoralized, facing veteran Austrian forces. Yet Napoleon transformed them. He spoke to them not as a distant commander, but as one of their own, promising honor, plunder, and a place in history. He drove them to rapid victories at Montenotte, Lodi, and Arcole, striking with speed and unpredictability, slicing through enemy lines before they could react. Each battle added luster to his reputation and tightened the bond between him and his soldiers. He cultivated that bond with care, knowing that an army's devotion could be more enduring than any political favor. He shared their hardships, marched beside them, and endured the same bitter rations. But behind his gestures of camaraderie lay an unshakable self-belief and an insatiable hunger for power. Every victory was both a military triumph and a stepping stone towards something larger. He sent triumphant bulletins back to France, filled with dramatic accounts of his campaigns, ensuring that his name became inseparable from France's fortunes. Parisian newspapers began to speak of him as a savior, a new kind of leader forged by the revolution's fire, neither aristocrat nor mere soldier, but a man of destiny. While politicians in Paris plotted and counterplotted, Napoleon built an independent sphere of authority on the battlefield. He negotiated armistices, dictated terms to conquered territories, and moved French borders almost as if he commanded a nation rather than just an army. This audacity alarmed some in the government, yet they couldn't restrain him. His victories brought wealth and prestige to the Republic, and the people adored him. The Directory, weak and unpopular, tolerated his growing influence because they feared losing him more than they feared his ambition. They sensed, though perhaps too late, that he was no longer simply a servant of the state, but a figure rising above it. His mind was constantly in motion, calculating not only where to place his cannons, but where to place himself in history. He studied Caesar and Alexander, seeking not just to emulate them, but to surpass them. He believed the revolution had swept away the old order and left a void that only someone with his will could fill. The chaos that crushed others only sharpened him. Every setback became a lesson, every triumph a claim to greater authority. He presented himself as the embodiment of revolutionary energy, yet remained untouched by its ideology, wearing its colors while thinking like a monarch in waiting. By the end of the decade, Napoleon was no longer just a soldier of fortune. He had become the most celebrated general in France, a symbol of its resurgence and its defiance. His rise seemed meteoric, but it was built on methodical calculation and relentless drive. He had mastered the art of appearing indispensable, convincing France that without him, its victories would wither and its enemies would triumph. In the smoldering aftermath of revolution, as governments rose and collapsed like waves on a stormy sea, his star burned steadily brighter, promising order forged through conquest.
Those who watched him closely could already sense that his ambitions were expanding beyond the battlefield, stretching toward the heart of power itself, though few yet understood how far he intended to go. His mind was constantly in motion, calculating not only where to place his cannons, but where to place himself in history. He studied Caesar and Alexander, seeking not just to emulate them, but to surpass them. He believed the revolution had swept away the old order and left a void that only someone with his will could fill. The chaos that crushed others only sharpened him. Every setback became a lesson, every triumph a claim to greater authority. He presented himself as the embodiment of revolutionary energy, yet remained untouched by its ideology, wearing its colors while thinking like a monarch in waiting. By the end of the decade, Napoleon was no longer just a soldier of fortune. He had become the most celebrated general in France, a symbol of its resurgence and its defiance. His rise seemed meteoric, but it was built on methodical calculation and relentless drive. He had mastered the art of appearing indispensable, convincing France that without him, its victories would wither and its enemies would triumph. In the smoldering aftermath of revolution, as governments rose and collapsed like waves on a stormy sea, his star burnt steadily brighter, promising order forged through conquest. Those who watched him closely could already sense that his ambitions were expanding beyond the battlefield, stretching toward the heart of power itself, though few yet understood how far he intended to go.
Napoleon returned from Egypt shrouded in both failure and myth. The campaign had been strategically disastrous, leaving much of the French fleet destroyed and the army stranded. Yet he had managed to slip back to France before the full weight of defeat settled upon him. He understood that perception mattered more than reality. By the time he set foot in Paris, tales of his victories at the pyramids and his escape from British blockades had already spread. France was weary of the Directory's corruption and weakness, and the people hungered for a figure strong enough to end the chaos. Napoleon appeared to them not as a man retreating from disaster, but as a conqueror returning from distant triumphs. He had calculated this carefully, knowing that his moment had arrived. The Directory was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Its five-man executive could neither control the fractious legislature nor suppress the uprisings that flared across the country. Inflation, food shortages, and military defeats had eroded its legitimacy. Royalists plotted restoration, Jacobins dreamed of renewed terror, and the public drifted toward apathy or revolt. Amid this disarray, the army remained the only coherent force, and within the army, loyalty to Napoleon was unmatched. He had cultivated that loyalty over years of victories, and now it became the foundation of his political strategy. He conspired with key figures, including Emmanuel Sieyès, who saw in him the strong arm needed to preserve the Republic while secretly believing they could control him. They underestimated his ambition. On the 18th of Brumaire, according to the revolutionary calendar, he struck. Under the pretense of defending the government from an imaginary Jacobin plot, he had troops surround the legislature and coerced its members into dissolving the Directory. His presence was electric and overwhelming. Even those who despised him felt themselves swept along by the force of his will. The coup unfolded swiftly, with little bloodshed, and by its end, Napoleon stood as first consul of a new regime. He presented it as a restoration of order, claiming to save the revolution from its own decay, yet in truth it marked its quiet burial. The Republic had ceased to exist in all but name, replaced by a structure that concentrated nearly all authority in his hands. Once in power, he moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate control. He rewrote the Constitution, ensuring that the machinery of state revolved around his office. He restructured the administrative map of France, placing prefects loyal to him in every department to enforce central authority. He reformed taxation, revived the national bank, and stabilized the currency, halting the economic spiral that had impoverished the populace. These measures won the support of merchants and landowners who craved stability more than liberty. He reconciled with the Catholic Church through the Concordat of 1801, restoring religious worship while ensuring the Church remained subordinate to the state. This pacified the devout peasantry, removing a source of rebellion that had plagued the Republic for years. Each reform was framed as a gift to the people, yet each also tightened his grip. He understood that laws could be more enduring than battles. He oversaw the creation of the Civil Code, a sweeping codification of French law that enshrined property rights, secular authority, and the legal equality of men. It streamlined the legal system, binding the nation under uniform rules. Though it carried the scent of revolutionary ideals, it was also a monument to his control, embedding his vision of order into the fabric of everyday life. This achievement alone would have secured his place in history, yet for him it was only another stepping stone. He saw governance not as an end, but as a platform from which to ascend even higher. While he cloaked his rule in republican language, he increasingly adopted the symbols and rituals of monarchy. He filled his court with loyalists who owed their titles to him, creating a new aristocracy of merit bound to his fortunes. He surrounded himself with grandeur, knowing that power must be seen to be believed. His image appeared everywhere, in paintings, statues, and public ceremonies, carefully crafted to suggest destiny rather than ambition. The army, still fiercely devoted, formed the backbone of his regime, and he rewarded it with spoils and honors. The people, exhausted by years of revolution and war, accepted his rising authority with relief, preferring the promise of order to the uncertainty of liberty. By 1804, his transformation was nearly complete. He staged a referendum that predictably returned overwhelming support for making him emperor. In a ceremony of immense theatricality at Notre Dame, he crowned himself, lifting the diadem from the Pope's hands to place it on his own head. It was a gesture calculated to show that his authority derived from no earthly superior. The Republic was dead, its ideals reduced to ornaments in his imperial regalia. He stood now as Napoleon I, sovereign not by birthright but by force of will, a man who had remade himself into the equal of kings and intended to surpass them all. Yet within this triumph lay the seeds of his downfall. His belief in his own infallibility hardened into arrogance. He tolerated no dissent, dismissed caution as weakness, and viewed compromise as defeat. His mind, once fluid and adaptive, grew increasingly rigid under the weight of his certainty. He began to see Europe not as a constellation of nations, but as a board upon which his destiny must be played out. What had begun as a quest to rescue France from chaos evolved into an ambition to dominate the continent. Those close to him sensed this shift, though they dared not speak of it. He had reached the pinnacle of power, yet the higher he climbed, the more he became isolated within the echo of his own genius, convinced that the world existed to bend beneath his will. What had begun as a quest to rescue France from chaos evolved into an ambition to dominate the continent. Those close to him sensed this shift, though they dared not speak of it. He had reached the pinnacle of power, yet the higher he climbed, the more he became isolated within the echo of his own genius, convinced that the world existed to bend beneath his will.
Napoleon, crowned as emperor, unleashed a force that swept across Europe with relentless momentum. He no longer fought for the survival of the French Republic or the consolidation of his personal rule. Now he pursued the transformation of the continent itself. His armies became instruments of his will, vast and disciplined machines that moved with an efficiency unseen in modern warfare. They marched across rivers and mountains, through kingdoms and empires, breaking coalitions as if they were brittle glass. The victory at Austerlitz in 1805 became the symbol of his ascendancy, when he shattered the combined might of Austria and Russia in a single day, forcing emperors to retreat while he redrew the map of Central Europe at his command. The Holy Roman Empire, which had endured for centuries, crumbled into history beneath the pressure of his ambitions. After Austerlitz, his campaigns gained an almost mythic character. He crushed Prussia at Jena and Auerstedt, dismembered its territories, and placed his brothers and loyal marshals on the thrones of conquered lands. He humiliated Austria again at Wagram, carving new client states out of the wreckage of old monarchies. Everywhere he went, he imposed the Napoleonic Code, reorganized governments, and dismantled feudal privileges, believing he was bringing the light of modernity even as he tightened French control. The old order of Europe trembled under his steps, its ancient crowns toppled and replaced by men who owed their power solely to him. For a moment, it seemed he had achieved what no conqueror since Charlemagne had dared to dream: a continental empire under one supreme will. Yet the grandeur of his empire carried within it the seeds of its unraveling. The very scale of his dominion created pressures that no army could fully suppress. Nationalist fervor stirred in the lands he had conquered, where people saw in French rule not liberation but domination. Guerrilla warfare erupted in Spain after his attempt to place his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The Spanish campaign became a bleeding wound, draining French resources as local partisans ambushed convoys, assassinated officers, and melted into the countryside before his forces could retaliate. British gold and arms flowed steadily to his enemies, sustaining the resistance and tying down hundreds of thousands of French troops. What had been meant as a swift assertion of authority turned into a grinding war that corroded the foundations of his empire. To break Britain's power, he launched the Continental System, an ambitious economic blockade designed to strangle British trade by forbidding European nations from dealing with it. At first, the scheme seemed bold and innovative, but its flaws soon became apparent. Smuggling flourished along every coastline, neutral nations defied the embargo, and the British Navy maintained its grip on the seas. The blockade hurt his own allies as much as it hurt Britain, sowing resentment and economic chaos. Ports grew silent, merchants went bankrupt, and famine crept into regions cut off from colonial imports. Even his own subjects began to question whether his vision of total domination justified the suffering it caused. The empire's outward brilliance concealed fractures spreading silently beneath its surface. Napoleon himself changed as the weight of empire settled upon him. The man who had once dazzled with his speed of thought and flexibility of mind became increasingly rigid, seeing disobedience everywhere. He trusted fewer and fewer advisors, convinced that betrayal lurked behind every hesitation. His marshals, once celebrated for their initiative, were reduced to extensions of his will, punished for any sign of independence. He ruled not only through law and conquest, but through fear, demanding total loyalty from those around him. In his court, flattery replaced candor, and silence became safer than truth. The empire's vast bureaucracy carried his decrees to every corner of Europe, but its pulse beat solely to his rhythm, leaving it vulnerable to collapse if his hand faltered. His personal life mirrored the tension of his reign. Obsessed with producing an heir, he divorced Josephine despite their long shared history, marrying the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise to link himself with ancient dynasties. The marriage symbolized his desire to legitimize his empire in the eyes of old Europe. Yet it also marked a shift from revolutionary merit to imperial dynasty, alienating many of his original supporters. The son she bore him became the symbol of a future he believed he was forging, though the child would never rule. Even as he built monuments to his power, from triumphal arches to palaces, the mood in Paris grew more brittle, more anxious. The people celebrated his victories with pageantry, but behind the splendor, they whispered of endless wars and rising conscriptions. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the shores of Portugal to the gates of Moscow. Yet its size became a curse.
To hold it together required constant motion, ceaseless campaigns, and the unbroken aura of invincibility. Any sign of weakness threatened to unravel the entire structure. Napoleon sensed this and pushed himself harder, driving his armies into new wars not out of necessity, but out of the conviction that only conquest could sustain what he had built. The burden of glory became a trap, compelling him to risk everything to maintain the illusion of control. His decisions grew faster, sharper, more reckless, as though he sought to outrun the shadow of failure that lengthened at his heels. Beneath the glittering surface of parades and coronations, the empire was already smoldering. National uprisings spread like sparks through the fabric of his dominion, igniting resistance in Italy, the Balkans, and the German states. Old monarchies regrouped in secret, awaiting the moment to strike. Even his allies, bound to him by fear more than loyalty, began to waver. The empire stood like a vast edifice built on shifting ground, magnificent yet unstable. Napoleon had forged it through brilliance, speed, and willpower, but now it demanded more from him than even he could endlessly give. The flames of discontent crept silently through the beams of his creation, unseen by those who still marveled at its grandeur, yet destined to blaze when the winds of history turned.
In 1812, Napoleon launched the grandest gamble of his career, leading the largest army Europe had ever seen into the vastness of Russia. He believed that a swift and decisive blow against the Russian Empire would force it back into his continental system and secure his dominion over the continent. The campaign began with confidence and ceremonial splendor, hundreds of thousands of troops marching eastward beneath the imperial eagles, their banners snapping in the summer wind. Yet the farther they advanced, the more elusive their victory became. The Russians refused open battle, retreating deeper into their own land while burning villages and fields behind them. The French pursued shadows across endless plains, their supply lines stretching thin, their horses collapsing from exhaustion, their men growing hollow with hunger. When the armies finally met at Borodino, the clash was apocalyptic. A single day drenched in fire and blood that left the battlefield littered with corpses, yet yielded no decisive triumph. The Russians withdrew, but not in defeat. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he found not a prize, but a ruin. The city had been abandoned and then set ablaze, its wooden quarters consumed in an inferno that swallowed supplies, shelter, and hope. He waited for a Russian surrender that never came, as the autumn cold seeped into the bones of his soldiers and the first snowflakes whispered of the approaching winter. At last he ordered a retreat, but by then the retreat had become a rout. Frost, famine, disease, and relentless Cossack raids tore the once mighty Grande Armée to shreds. Only a tattered fraction of his forces staggered back across the Berezina River. The legend of his invincibility cracked in the icy silence of the Russian steppes. The disaster in Russia ignited Europe. Nations that had bowed to his power rose in rebellion, sensing that the Titan had faltered. Prussia, Austria, and Britain joined Russia in a new coalition, their armies converging on the collapsing French sphere. Napoleon raised new forces with astonishing speed, but they lacked the veterans and cohesion that had once made his armies unstoppable. In the campaigns of 1813, he still displayed flashes of his old brilliance, winning bloody victories at Lutzen and Bautzen, but each triumph left him weaker, bleeding strength he could not replenish. The decisive blow came at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, where the combined might of Europe crushed his army and drove it westward in chaos. One by one, his satellite kingdoms broke away, and even his marshals began to waver, exhausted by endless war. The walls of his empire crumbled inward. By early 1814, the coalition forces crossed into France itself. Napoleon fought like a cornered lion, striking at their divided columns with furious speed, but the odds were hopeless. Paris fell to the enemy in March, and his marshals, seeing the end, forced him to abdicate.
The man who had crowned himself emperor was compelled to surrender the throne he had forged through conquest. They sent him into exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba, granting him the hollow title of sovereign there. From ruling half of Europe, he was reduced to overseeing a rocky scrap of land, pacing its hills as though still commanding vast campaigns in his mind. Yet even in defeat, his spirit remained unbroken, and whispers spread that he watched the continent still, waiting for the moment to return. In the spring of 1815, that moment came. He escaped Elba with a handful of followers, landed on the French coast, and marched north toward Paris. As he advanced, soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him, drawn once more to the magnetism that had once carried them to glory. The restored Bourbon king fled, and Napoleon entered the capital in triumph, reclaiming power without firing a shot. For a brief 100 days, the empire seemed reborn. He drafted new plans, rallied his loyalists, and prepared to confront the coalition gathering to destroy him again. It was a desperate gamble, but he had built his life on such gambles before. This time, however, his luck had finally run dry. The decisive encounter came at Waterloo, under gray skies and heavy rain. Facing the British under Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher, Napoleon sought to shatter them before they could unite. The battle raged through mud and smoke, his old brilliance flickering in sudden maneuvers and furious charges. Yet the cohesion and ferocity that had once defined his armies were gone. The British lines held, the Prussians arrived, and by nightfall his forces were broken. The field that had seen his last bid for glory became the grave of his empire. He fled toward Paris, but the government abandoned him, and his name now carried the weight of ruin rather than destiny. He abdicated again, this time with no conditions, and surrendered to the British. They sent him to St. Helena, a remote volcanic island lost in the South Atlantic, far from the world he had once commanded. There, winds howled across barren cliffs, and the ocean stretched endless in every direction, a prison of water and time. Cut off from his family, his allies, and the currents of history, he lived in enforced isolation, watched by guards who feared even his shadow. He walked the rocky paths alone, revisiting in his mind the battlefields where he had stood as master of Europe, now reduced to a solitary figure etched against an indifferent horizon. His body weakened, but his mind remained sharp, and he dictated his memories, shaping his own legend even as the years eroded him. To those who glimpsed him on the island, he seemed less like a man than a memory lingering in flesh. In the silence of St. Helena, the Titan who had once bent continents to his will dwindled into myth. The world moved on without him, the borders he had redrawn shifting again under new treaties and wars, while he paced the crags like a ghost of an age of fire. He had reached for immortality and grasped it only as a story. The Emperor of Europe now lived in a stone house lashed by ocean winds, his kingdom reduced to recollection, his throne to a wooden chair, his empire to fading echoes. Even as he breathed, he belonged more to history than to the present, a figure already half legend whose life had ended though his name had not.
Napoleon's final years unfolded in the remote isolation of St. Helena, a barren island lashed by the relentless winds of the South Atlantic. Stripped of power and surrounded only by a handful of loyal attendants, he spent his days in Longwood House, a damp and decaying residence that seemed to mirror the slow decline of his own body. His once vigorous frame grew frail, his steps weakened, and illness gnawed at him with increasing ferocity. The man who had commanded empires now struggled to summon the strength to walk through the small garden outside his quarters, pausing often to catch his breath. The oppressive humidity corroded his health and his spirit, and yet his mind remained sharp, tethered to the great dramas he had once orchestrated. He immersed himself in the past, dictating memoirs that sought to shape the narrative of his life for posterity.
Surrounded by maps and papers, he recounted campaigns, treaties, and coronations, as though by reconstructing them he could briefly resurrect the empire he had lost. His attendants noted how his eyes lit up when he spoke of Austerlitz or Jena, as if the memory of those triumphs offered him fleeting reprieve from his confinement. He sought solace in rewriting his story, framing himself not as a conqueror brought down by hubris, but as a visionary betrayed by fortune and small-minded kings. Every page he dictated was an attempt to wrest victory from the jaws of oblivion. Outside the walls of his exile, Europe continued to debate his legacy with fervor. Some saw him as the embodiment of human potential, a man who had risen from obscurity to bend the continent to his will. They hailed his reforms, which had outlived him even as his empire had crumbled: the civil code that shaped laws across Europe, the centralized administrative systems, the secular education he promoted, the meritocratic ideals that had chipped away at the old feudal hierarchies. Others condemned him as a tyrant who had drowned nations in blood to satisfy his insatiable ego, whose wars had left millions dead and countless families shattered. Newspapers, salons, and parliaments evoked his name either as a beacon of progress or a warning against unchecked ambition. As the years passed, his physical decline accelerated. He endured agonizing pain from what many suspected to be stomach cancer, yet he concealed his suffering behind a brittle dignity. He dressed each morning in his faded uniform, the same style he had worn at the height of his power, as though refusing to concede that his reign had ended. The island became his entire universe: the rocky cliffs, the gray sea, the few rooms he was allowed to wander. Storms battered the coast as he lay in bed, listening to the roar of the wind as if it carried echoes of distant battlefields. He no longer commanded armies, yet the world still seemed to orbit around the gravitational pull of his memory. In 1821, death claimed him quietly. His final moments passed not on a battlefield nor in the grandeur of a palace, but in the dim chamber of Longwood House, with only a few faithful witnesses by his side. He left behind a modest collection of possessions, some books, personal letters, a few keepsakes from his glory days, and an immense immaterial legacy. News of his death rippled through Europe like a phantom cannon shot. Monarchs felt relief, revolutionaries mourned, and the common people whispered his name as though he might return. The man was gone, yet his shadow loomed larger than ever. In the decades that followed, that shadow only deepened. His story became the subject of endless books, paintings, and myths, each bending his image to reflect the hopes or fears of a changing world. To some, he remained a hero who had shattered old orders and ignited the spark of modernity. To others, he embodied the destructive folly of human pride, proof that even the mightiest could be dragged down by their own ambition. His name outlived kingdoms and dynasties, echoing through the halls of history as both a symbol and a warning. Napoleon had redrawn the map of Europe, reshaped its laws, and altered the trajectory of nations. He had shown how one person's will could ripple across continents, toppling thrones and inspiring millions. Yet his downfall revealed the fragility of power and the perilous cost of seeking to dominate the world. His life became a mirror reflecting both the heights of human greatness and the abysses of human destruction. Though his body had long since crumbled into dust, his presence persisted, a spectral force haunting the modern age. His shadow stretched over centuries, a reminder that glory and ruin often walk hand in hand, and that the echo of a single life can outlast empires.